Several leaders of Asia-Pacific economies are gathering in San Francisco for the APEC summit. All eyes, of course, are on the much-anticipated Biden-Xi meeting on the sidelines. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in the U.S. on the eve of this high-stakes meet. The last time he met U.S. President Joe Biden was in Bali last year on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Since then, U.S.-China ties have seen several flare-ups. Amid the tensions, both nations did increase diplomatic efforts. A series of meetings have taken place recently between U.S. and Chinese high-ranking officials. And now, finally, the presidents are coming to the table as they try to stabilize frayed ties. This is Xi Jinping's first U.S. visit in nearly 6 years. President Biden says that the talks between the two leaders will seek to resume normal communications between the two superpowers.
Get back on a normal course of corresponding, being able to pick up the phone and talk to one another if there's a crisis, being able to make sure our military still have contact with one another. We can't take, as I told you, we're not trying to decouple from China, but what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better.
High on Biden's priority list will be restoring military-to-military communication with China. The talks are also expected to be on Taiwan, the wars in Ukraine and West Asia, as well as discussions on trade and people-to-people ties. The meeting comes in the wake of a big chill in the ties between the two sides. The chill has only become worse due to some recent developments. The ties took a downward turn after the U.S. forces shot down what they allegedly called a Chinese spy balloon over skies in February this year. Then there is the issue of Taiwan, which has resulted in the suspension of military ties between the two countries. China suspended communication after former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year. China also expressed anger over a stopover in the U.S. by Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen earlier this year. Another point of friction between the two nations is the tech war. In the latest, the U.S. has tightened export controls to keep China from acquiring advanced computer chips. Beijing has protested the move. China's stance, which it asserts is neutral on the Russia-Ukraine war, has been criticized by America. Ahead of the Xi-Biden meeting, several protesters have gathered in San Francisco. Some held signs that read, "End CCP," the initials of the Chinese Communist Party, while others held Taiwanese and Tibetan flags. Several pro-China demonstrators have also gathered near the APEC summit venue. And now, to get you more insights about the APEC summit and what's happening on ground, we are now being joined by our Voice of America correspondent, Jessica Stone. She's live with us on this broadcast from San Francisco. Welcome to the broadcast, Jessica.
Great to see you.
Jessica, all eyes, of course, are on the summit. More importantly, the Xi-Biden dynamic. What are experts predicting? What's on the agenda?
Well, they're going to meet outside San Francisco in a state called the Filoli Estate. And what's really particularly interesting about this location is that it has orchards, it has beautiful grounds and gardens, and a walking trail reminiscent of Sunnylands. If you think about the Xi-Obama summit there back in the mid-2000s, where we were really in a different place with U.S.-China relations. In particular, this location has a bridge that literally bridges the Pacific tectonic plate where it adjoins the North American tectonic plate. And this is such a metaphor for two of the largest economies in the world trying to maintain communication over a fault line that has become larger and larger in the relationship, that being trade and national security. And so these two leaders expected to spend 4 hours together at that location outside of San Francisco, a working lunch, a walking tour, meetings with national security advisors and secretaries of state and foreign ministers, all of that culminating with a press conference given by President Biden solo, nothing from Xi Jinping. And then we expect to see President Xi at some events in the evening with the CEOs and that lauded dinner with the CEOs that was, I think, $40,000 a plate.
Jessica, it's very interesting what you've said about the significance of the location, the bridge. It's almost like a metaphor to sort of maybe fix the frayed ties. Will we see a thaw in ties, given the contentious issues that are on the table?
I think that's the question everyone is going into this with. The question really becomes, though, how do you describe a thaw in ties? If a thaw in ties means that there are additional lines of communication open, that there are some concessions on either side, that could potentially be viewed as a success. But as you heard from President Biden, he just wants some sort of communication with the Chinese government, and in particular at the leadership level. It has been almost a year since these two leaders met, and the U.S. and China have been essentially working up to this moment for that entirety, and much of it derailed by that so-called Chinese spy balloon incident you mentioned earlier.
Right. Jessica, let's talk about the host city, San Francisco. There's been a lot of criticism about San Francisco displacing the homeless or hiding them away, putting up barricades to prevent protests once the Chinese premier arrives. What can you tell us about that? Is their security beefed up in the city to avoid any kind of protests at this point?
Well, there is definitely much more security, but none of the security I've seen is anything out of the ordinary, in particular not out of the ordinary from something like what I saw in New Delhi when I joined you for the G20. There are still homeless on the streets. There's still the sense of people using the streets for bathrooms. And this was a city that had really become taken over in many parts of the city by the homeless population. There was a cleanup. I think it was probably necessary for us to be able to use the streets. I can tell you that where I am standing right now, near the ferry building, this is actually where we're told by law enforcement that those protesters will gather, and they don't even have to file a permit. They can just show up. So there really isn't a limitation on them. Law enforcement says they don't get any kind of heads up. They just monitor social media to see who might be coming, and they're anticipating about 10,000 people to deliver a bunch of different kinds of protests on Wednesday, because, of course, that is the major day between Xi and Biden, and it is the first day of the Leaders Summit.
Right, Jessica Stone, thank you so much for all those updates. We'll, of course, keep coming back to you for more once the summit gets underway and once the two leaders sit down for talks.
You bet.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.